This is Pete Moran, Halo Talks NYC. I am on the roof deck in late July with a very close friend of mine and mentor, Peter Brockway. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Pete, how are you? Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. Well, it's an honor to have you on the show, and it's been exactly 20 years since we know each other.
That's exactly right.
So I was the first senior associate to work at Brockway, Moran and Partners down in Boca Raton.
I didn't even remember that. So you were the first.
I was the first senior associate.
Okay,
yes,
the first, and
it's on my resume and on my bio, and I'm not giving that title up ever. I think I actually have a copy of my old business card as well.
Is that right?
Yeah. It was
That's
old
fun
school.
to have that.
The blue bars.
Yep.
All going towards growth, which we'll talk about. So Peter has been in the private equity world for a long time, originally from a fellow Long Islander. So why don't you give your background, and then we can pick it up, after you tell people what you've been doing.
Yeah, sure.
For the last...
I grew up not too far from where we are right now, outside of Manhattan on Long Island, and was here as I got through high school, but then kind of found my way to Florida after graduate school. For lots of reasons, I liked it down there. And I've actually only worked in Florida, even though I grew up in New York. I've only worked in Florida now for some 40 years. It's been a while.
Most people go down there to retire. You went there to start.
I went there to start, yeah. So that's exactly right. So when you get to retirement, it's kind of easy. You already
have a 561 area code number and all set, right?
Nothing changes. Nothing changes.
So, you want to talk about your entry into Trivest originally and how you kind of got your sea legs there and then start up your own fund?
Yeah, through my first part of my career, I was in commercial banking. Actually, I started out with working for a very small operating company that owned a TV station, some other assets in South Florida. And then I got into commercial and investment banking, and one thing led to another. And here I ended up in private equity, which really wasn't even called private equity at that time, just about 33 years ago in the mid-'80s. And at that time, it really was off the radar. I mean, when you came out of business school in the 80s, people were going into consulting, they were going into investment banking, but they weren't going into private equity because it was just kind of below the radar.
And there are probably only like 30 private equity funds back then.
I think the biggest one, at that time, KKR, was like a $150 million fund or something.
Yeah,
so, the numbers have just totally changed. But I liked it because I liked doing deals. I kind of got that out of investment banking, but I liked being involved with companies for a longer period of time, which I got out of my initial experience working for the TV station and some of the other businesses. So I thought with private equity, you'd be involved in both. You'd make the deals, and then you'd stay long term. You could help the company grow. And I had no idea of what it would become. At that point, I think our fund was $11 million.
Wow.
We were literally doing deals with, in some cases, no equity or $1,000. Sometimes 5%, 10%.
That would be called a highly leveraged management
Well, and the funny thing is, when we started back in those days, literally, if it didn't have a 45% internal rate of return target, you wouldn't do it. So literally, I'd have deals that showed a 40% compounded rate of return, and the return was too low.
It didn't get through committee.
It wouldn't get well, and there was no committee. It was committee. My boss. My boss was the committee, because everything was just so simple and kind of low key compared to what the industry is today.
So to give people background, so in a typical private equity deal today, you'd assume somewhere around 50 to 70,
50,
30.
Or even if, with the higher prices today, sometimes it could be, 70% or something like that. But so the equity is much higher. And most people, I would say, are doing returns these days on a reasonable case of 18 to 20%.
Right.
I would say even sometimes accepting lower than that, especially as you get bigger deals, which are still beating the public markets and are still great return, but they're obviously very, very different.
Right.
Now, the truth, obviously, with returns is some of them are higher than that and some of them are lower than that. But
that's what everything doesn't show up the way it is in the spreadsheet.
Amazingly enough, it doesn't work exactly the way the model says. Hard to believe.
So, just for our listeners here, so internal rate of return is you put money down in year 1, and then in year 5, you make the return, and then you calculate backwards what that would have been on an annual basis. So 18 to 20% is the kind of the target now, I guess, for given the competition in the market and the pricing.
Yeah. Now, one thing which is really changing it somewhat is historically the multiples or the prices that have been paid have been going higher and higher and higher. So some of the return over the last 10, 20 years is people are selling typically at higher multiples than they bought at. Mm-hmm. As long as that stays the same, it won't be a drag, but it's unlikely to continue at the rate it is now. And, everybody looks at it and thinks, well, maybe multiples come down, because right now they're at an all-time high.
Mm-hmm. So, when you talk to a family that owns a company and they're thinking about doing a private equity transaction, what are some of the things that you say, look, if you do a deal with us or a private equity firm, here's what you should expect, and here's the reasons why you should do it, and then let's talk about some of the reasons why, you're becoming either a partner that you might not have ever had before, you may become an employee, which you've never been before. So, let's talk a little bit about, the benefits of private equity, and then here's like the risks that risk return. You can't get off that line.
Yeah, one of the funniest responses we've had to our outreaching, it was a few years back. We were doing a proactive search in the urgent care market for urgent care centers, and so we're going out to people who are not for sale and trying to convince them that they should sell to us.
Right.
And we actually ended up doing this deal, which has become a great deal for us. But the owner said, look, I'm not looking for any money. I don't need any money, and I don't want a boss. And so he ended up getting persuaded it was a good idea. And the reasons he got persuaded is the reason a lot of people get persuaded is, first of all, you diversify your net worth, right? Because if you're typically a small business owner, most of your net worth is in the business. And a lot of folks haven't taken significant distributions. A lot of times they've reinvested it into the company. So if you want to diversify your net worth, it's a great way to do that. Two is, a lot of times companies get to a level where they need help to get to the next level. They need to bring in additional management talent. Maybe they need capital. Maybe they need the experiences of building out multiple states, going out geographically, or something like that. And so there are these great advantages that you can get by teaming up with a private equity partner. And then the other thing is when you leverage the company, we were just talking about it, let's say it's 50% leverage. So when you're buying back into the company, you're buying back in at basically half the price that you sold at for the equity. And so we've had a number of cases where someone's bought back in 20% of the company after they sold it to us, and they've made more money from selling that 20% at the end of our deal than they did by selling 100% to us initially.
Gotcha.
And that's because the company's grown so much.
So let's just explain. So there are certain levels of debt that a private equity firm can take on that an individual can't, because you just have a personal guarantee on it. So it's really not real money to you. It's still contingent upon you paying it back.
Right.
Whereas, if you're doing a leverage recap, that leverage is most of the time going to the owner of the business. So they're benefiting from a dividend up front, and then also owning a higher levered business with no personal guarantees.
Right. And then, like you say, the debt you can get as a private equity source is always going to be more than what you can get as an individual, because there's new capital coming in. So that's going to help.
So that's underneath
the bank debt or the debt. And then also we have relationships, and they also know that there's additional resources backing up the company that give the lenders more comfort. So no doubt. I mean, typically a deal these days is 5-6 times EBITDA in leverage. Sometimes bigger deals can be a little bit more than that, but that's kind of the range. And most individuals wouldn't dream of taking down that much leverage.
So when you've looked at companies historically, there's this balance between, okay, I can probably push the envelope on how much debt I put on the company, but I've got experience, you've got experience, you've seen people over-lever businesses, and you say, hey, look, let's not do an extra turn, because if we do what we're going to do, this return is not going to be based on financial engineering. It's going to be on operational performance.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, one of the ways I've thought of that historically is you never want the business to be affected by the debt. You never want it to be limited by having the debt. You want the capital structure to enable growth, not to inhibit it. In some cases, like this urgent care network, and I think I can say who it is. It's MD Now, which is in South Florida. That deal was very unusual. We did that all equity. We actually took no leverage because we knew we were going to build out a lot of new locations. We went actually from 6 locations to 42 locations over our hold period of time, and we did not want to be held back at all. So we did that all equity. Now that's kind of unusual, but the thought that you want to make sure that the company, you never want to have the finance control the company. You want the company to basically be the lead, and for whatever is in its best interest to be what carries the day.
So that's an interesting segue into you invested in MD Now when urgent care and clinics were kind of seemed like it was trending towards that way and outside the hospital, but it wasn't. I don't know, give you an example. Like a couple of years ago, I was reading about all these VC investments in like the drone industry. And it kind of like
right.
raised my antenna, no pun intended, to say, you know what, there's something big that's about to happen. I don't really know if it's really been talked about fully, but like when you invest and you say, okay, look, I'm going to put this investment down into MD now. How do you calibrate in your mind? Like, what does the future look like when I want to sell this? Like, is there going to be is every CVS going to turn into like an urgent care, or is like, we're going to set up this regional platform? So how do you kind of like take a crystal ball to your private equity? Because, you need to be at the right place at the right time. You're the one who said to me, create something of value and someone will pay you for it. But it also helps when everyone wants to get into the sector.
Right.
And the sector is like the new thing, but you have to get in a little early.
Yeah, and you try to get in before everybody knows. I mean, by the time everybody knows that you want to be in something, it's probably too late. It's the old joke about that, if your shoe shine person is telling you to go into the stock market, that probably is a sign that's
the taxi cab.
Someone who doesn't inherently dealing with that every day. So I think what we tried to do with MD Now, and actually we'd done it earlier with Air Medical, which was an air ambulance helicopter company, is look at a couple things. One is it was increasing the level of service. Anybody who's gone into an emergency room knows that you can wait there forever. You can unless if you're about to die, obviously they're going to take you in. But if it's, if you've got something that's not life-threatening, you may wait hours. And it can be $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 for the visit. With urgent care, it's, typically $150. And maybe if you've got insurance, your copay is $20 or $30 or something like that. And you're in and out typically in under an hour. So it's also favored by the healthcare industry because basically you're taking those non-critical visits off of the emergency room so they can concentrate on life-threatening situations. So you're helping the cost of the industry, you're helping the customer experience, and that this is a trend that's got legs because those are both very, great benefits. The other thing is that you probably are going to have a good way to sell if you can build up a chain. Like when we were 6 units at MD Now in South Florida, we were in one county, we were important, but we weren't.
That's when you invested at 6.
That's when we invested.
That's kind of a small business.
And that was a small deal for us.
Yeah.
Actually, that was a very small. I think it was our smallest deal ever. But we went from being 6 in one county to being 42 across 3 counties, and we clearly were the biggest provider in South Florida with a great brand name when we sold. So we're taking costs out of the system. We're increasing the service level to customers, and we're creating some value because there's a brand there. We did the same thing in a little bit different way with Air Medical, which was air ambulance helicopters.
Right.
And same thing. Actually, the trips on on a helicopter, if you're critically ill, are expensive. But that first hour, they call it the golden hour, after you get some life-threatening either injury or something like a stroke or a heart attack, is critically important. Because if you don't get into a hospital, your chances of having serious complications rise dramatically. And so you're actually taking costs out of the system by getting someone to a trauma center early, getting care, and usually their prognosis is much, much better.
And that was also a membership. Insurance
that was a membership.
Too,
We had a lot of members. It started, not to get into too much detail of it, but it started actually as a membership in very rural areas because these were areas where it would be over 3 hours to get to a major trauma center. And so people were literally dying because they couldn't get to the hospital in time.
I gotcha.
And so you bought a membership in your town, and it basically gave you the ability to know you would get the service at, I think it was, I forget the details, but it was advantaged. And then you would get to, you would also be supporting your local service that would be protecting the lives of those citizens. So it was a kind of a win-win.
Gotcha. So you look at businesses and say, okay, there's wind at its sails. I can get in early, six locations. That's probably the earliest I've ever seen you get involved. But when you looked at those 6 locations, how much work did you do on, okay, here's what the unit economics are, and then also say, whether it's this CEO or partner or not, this person can go from, he can do from 6 to 42, or this woman can go from here to there, or do you have a conversation up front? So some entrepreneurs come to us and say, look, I know I can get it to here. But once I get it to here, I'm not the guy or I'm not the woman to do that. So how do you have those types of conversations, and you're very transparent and open, and that's helpful, and you're easy to talk to. But how have those conversations gone where you kind of know where maybe the company needs to get to, and you have alignment on those
we had
things?
a great CEO there and a partner that understood that we needed to add management to get to where we needed to. So we were adding actually executives within a month or two after we closed. So we added someone who was in charge of real estate. We added a chief financial officer. And ultimately, we added someone who was basically a number 2 person who became a number 1 person to run the company. So our partner knew that was important. His name is Peter Lamellis, Dr. Lamellis. And he had done a great job, had a wonderful vision of what the client experience would be or the patient experience, and a vision for what the chain could become, and knew that together, ultimately the reason he decided to work with us is that ultimately together we could achieve more than he would on his own. And so he accepted that vision, but that's really important. And it takes a certain mindset, because obviously you don't have control anymore.
Right.
So you can't just unilaterally decide something. And then from our side, I think one of the things that's important in private equity is understand the dynamics of what you're coming into. I always look at it, it's a little bit like a movie. So this movie, you're walking into a movie theater about halfway through. And there's been all this action that's going on before you've got there. And if you don't try to understand how the plot's developed and where the players are and what's going on, you're probably going to make some mistakes. So our job is to figure that out and to be seamless into the history of the company. And obviously the partner needs to understand that it's going to be a give and take between the two of us. And if both parties do that right, you can get tremendous results.
Yeah, I've had a number of clients, a number of private equity groups now have like okay, here's our 100-day plan that's like aligned with the CEO and the management team. Some of them have a 5-year plan. And I've seen, you talk about a movie, how much of the script do you try and write at, before closing versus, hey, look, like this world is somewhat unpredictable, and you can pivot in VC or early stage, but it's hard to pivot, some of these larger businesses. So how do you think about that?
Right. And I think as the industry has matured, it's even more important that you think through that in detail ahead of time. I mean, what's happened a little bit as prices have increased is that margin of error has shrunk, right? So if you're buying something, just to use numbers, at 5 times or 6 times or 7 times EBITDA or earnings, your margin of error is pretty good. If you're buying it at 10 times or 12 times or 14 times earnings, your margin has shrunk. And I think a lot of people say, I've seen this written and I think it's true, that today's model is pretty much people are either paying fully or maybe overpaying for assets and then trying to work their way out of that and then to gain by really taking the company forward and delivering value. And if you don't do that, it's not going to work.
Yeah, it seems like everything's about top line growth and growth in EBITDA, and you see all these books out that are have that diagonal line perfectly,
right?
Historically, and then into projections. How much do you think? When you look and say, okay, is it a buyer's market? Is it a seller's market? How do you kind of reframe? Like I was trained originally at Chase Manhattan Bank and DLJ, and then with you, and I'm like 8 times. Like that's a pretty healthy EBITDA margin multiple for a business, right? I'm basically paying you for 8 years worth of earnings. Like, shouldn't that be enough? Like, I'm going to get paid back technically in year 9. So like, how do you think about, or how do you retrain yourself to say, yeah, that business is worth 12 times?
Well, I mean, a lot of it comes in these models we were talking about where you're saying how it's going to work is, what is that exit multiple? Right. So if you buy it at 12 times and you sell it at 12 times and you build the company, it's going to work, right? Because it's by definition going to work.
Right.
And in a lot of cases, the multiples have increased quite a bit. Certainly in a number of our recent sales, they've increased quite well. But the trick is, I think you can get there, but you realize your margin of error has shrunk. And you are dependent on somewhat on multiples staying high. Now, they're never going to go back to where they were. I think I can say with surety, I think most people in our industry would agree, where they were 15, 20 years ago. It's not going to happen. But could they go down on the margin? Could they go down 1 times or 2 times or maybe even 3 times? That's a possibility. So a lot of it, it's literally these days we'll model deals with a decreasing multiple on sale. and see if can you get so much growth out of it that you could even sell at a lower multiple than you buy at. If you've got a deal that works for you, then you feel like you're bulletproof. But it really does amp up the pressure to really drive the company forward, because at these multiples, if you don't, you're not going to get the return you want.
So as you've done deals that have been successful, what are some of the characteristics that you kind of you talk about a movie, and I kind of talk about this a lot myself. It's like there's an analogy when I see an executive or I see a team and I see a business that they're in. I say, okay, that company's like this company that we did well with. Or
right.
Like this,
well,
this
and you can see that a little bit with MD Now and Air Medical. So they're both in healthcare. They both took costs out of the system. They were all in. They were taking costs out of the system, and they were improving healthcare. They were improving clients' health, or their amount of time they've got to dedicate to getting better. So where you see those characteristics, you're on the right side of things, and you're creating value. Sometimes earlier in our history, outsourcing was one of our trends. We had done a number of companies where we were an outsourced provider, where we could provide a service at a cheaper level or with higher quality than other people, and that created quite a value. So we had done outsourcing, for instance, in aviation. We've done a lot of aerospace deals over the years. And then we had a company called Cosmetic Essence, or CEI, that I think at the time we purchased it, did 70% of all the perfumes and colognes in the country, packaging
and labels, yeah.
Well, and manufacture of.
Oh yeah.
So
Okay.
we had the ability to, and we actually forward integrated to where we could actually help them, or backward integrated is the way to say it, design and spec perfumes and colognes. But with that kind of manufacturing power, even the biggest manufacturers or biggest brands of colognes and perfumes were coming to us because we could produce it less expensively with higher quality than they could.
And they didn't care that you worked with their competitors as long as it's taken.
No, as long as you never would transfer technology or ideas between them. But it lowered their cost, and there's such a good margin in perfumes and colognes that that it wasn't totally critical to them, and we were producing value for them because we had manufacturing abilities that would be way beyond what their brand by itself would where it would get you.
So from your standpoint, there you like the sector. And this was the best way to basically, provide the bullets and the weapons for everybody. And whoever wins at the brand level, that's great.
And then you always have additional things too, because in this case of perfumes and colognes, it was an entrepreneur who was very, very entrepreneurial, but it probably at a point where he needed to get additional resources into the company to help grow it, which we helped him with. And in that case, he made more money on selling his 20% than he did 100%. So you've got a win-win-win where the company goes forward, you create more opportunities, and obviously he was helped out a lot.
So when you look at deals, how much of your investing do you have to have a passion for a company?
It's helpful. I mean, I think you realize some you have more of a passion for than another. And the one thing, and I think most people in the private equity industry would agree with this, is you don't want to just invest in something because you're interested in it. That would not, to me, for your investors, that would not be a good idea.
Right.
If you think it's a great industry and it's got all the things we look for, and you got a passion for it, that's great. But between the two, I'd rather take a great opportunity in an industry where you don't maybe have a super interest in the business than one where it's a passion, but the business opportunity isn't as good. So the passion helps, but I think it needs to be additive, not the reason you do it.
Gotcha. Okay. And then as you look at private equity groups, we used to always say, we're industry agnostic and we'll look at any deals. And it seems now
that's changed.
Most private equity groups, it looks like they have like 3 buckets or 3 sectors. So how do you, and maybe we're going to talk about Blue Sea and the experience that a lot of the partners there had at Brockway Moran and some of the successful deals at Brockway kind of like have given them the knowledge base to go into those sectors and be the smartest people in the room or know everything potentially about
I think
industry.
that's what's happened over time. And there still is some firms that are broad enough and big enough that they can be very, very wide. But most private equity firms concentrate into certain sectors. And the reasons pretty self-evident, is that if you concentrate in an area and you know all the activity or most of the activity, you're going to be smarter. And it always is a little bit of a concern when you're competing against people who specialize in a sector and they won't pay that price for that particular asset, but you will. You tend to think, well, I'm probably the one that's wrong.
Right.
So most firms have gravitated now, like Blue Sea Capital, for instance, is aerospace and defense, because that's an area that we had historically done a number of deals with back at Brockway Moran. Healthcare, and we've talked about some of the healthcare deals we've done, and then general industrial, growth industrial. So those are things that you can build on, and you use that knowledge for the next deal. And I think it's one of the very clear changes in the industry over the last 10 or 20 years, and I don't see that changing just because there's such it definitely brings value, and I think it resonates with investors too, because they think you're bringing something more than just money. If someone thinks it's just money and I'm the investor giving you the capital, that's not going to work. So
for some of the people that have been listening to some of the political debates, and now like there's this arrow that's being tossed at the or shot at the private equity community over the last couple of weeks, and our conversation so far has been about, okay, I'm going from 6 locations to 42 locations. I'm building a management team, which all creates jobs, whether it's construction jobs, whether it's maintenance, whether it's utilities, whether it's doctors. So, just for the maybe a quick commercial, that like the private equity world is not like, we don't buy, you've never bought a business and say, hey, the reason why I'm buying this business is because I'm going to cut out $2 million of overhead. So could we just talk about, like the businesses that you've invested in, what they were, what they are today, how you kind of view human capital, and how like private equity is not here to erase jobs. We're actually creating growth, and the only way we do that is with people.
Yeah, and I think the arguments get a little silly, because private equity is really like any other business, right, that's trying to grow. So generally what you're trying to do is grow revenues, you're trying to grow the bottom line, and you're generally good, healthy companies are growing employment in their companies. The time where, the stories where people lose their jobs, which you never want to see, is just like corporate America, where, they acquire a company that's somewhat similar to them, right? And so there's some redundancies in jobs. And so in those situations, just like in corporate America, this happens all the time. It happens in private equity too, where you do sometimes lose jobs because you're buying a like company and you're combining operations. But I don't see private equity as different than corporate America. You're trying to grow a company. And overall, I think the track record of private equity is growth overall, is creating more opportunities and jobs and earnings. And, correctly done, it's a very hands-on activity where you are making a difference. This isn't like, I think some people think it's like a hedge fund if you're just picking the right stocks and you're just,
you can't buy and sell private equity portfolio companies.
No, and it's typically a 4 to 9 year type of horizon, and the best firms, lots of firms, are really building companies and creating value. So I think that like a lot of things, the arguments get overly simplified, and it becomes kind of a caricature of what's going on. But properly done private equity is very good for the economy, very good for employment, and there's just lots of examples of that.
And something happened at a recent debate I was listening to, where Kamala Harris said nobody owns stock, in the public markets that are in the, and I'm like, well, you have CalPERS, and CalPERS owns a lot of stock, and that's in everyone's retirement fund. That's in the retirement
thing is that a lot
system.
of the beneficiaries of private equity are actually pension funds or are
talk about where, I don't know if people fully appreciate that it's not just like, 10 high net worth investors that are, profiting from private equity.
Yeah, a lot of it is nonprofits. It could be pension funds. A lot of college endowments or other endowments are investing in that, and they're investing it for a simple reason. They think that the risk return is beneficial, that they're getting a return that they couldn't get in the public markets. And that it's, the return is more than made up for by the risk that takes. Clearly, there's a more risk just because of the capital structures. But the beneficiaries of private equity are all over, and a lot of them are people who are pensioners or people that are going to college.
And just so everyone understands, the the investors, so if it's NYU Endowment Fund or if it's CalPERS or if it's Florida Retirement System, they get their money back before the private equity professionals make any money. So I feel like that's an important.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that the fee, I think one of the things that people talk about, the fee incomes can be fairly high, and especially for the more money you have under management, obviously that goes up. So there is some money that's made off of just the management fees, and the bigger you get, to be fair. But the real profit, especially for mid-sized funds and below, is to make the investments work.
Right.
And usually, the thing that makes it work is investors, if everyone is doing well together, then nobody's upset, right? If an investment's very successful and 20% of the gains are going to the private equity firm and 80% to the investors, everybody's fine. The time people rightfully don't like it is when the money manager is making money, but the investors aren't. And I think the private equity model for, by and large, delivers that.
Yeah. So talk about what you're doing now. So you're officially an executive in residence at Wake Forest.
I am.
So how did that evolve, and how do you feel, teaching other people about, some of your business successes and rules and, steps along the way and obstacles? How do you feel about that, and how's that going?
Yeah, no, it's been a delight. It's really been a joy to do this over the last few years and continuing doing it. And I guess we'll be starting in about a month. My dad actually taught at Hofstra here on Long Island
Right
after he retired. So he was a CEO that had run a number of companies, and then very late in his 60s, going into his 70s, they asked him to teach at Hofstra. He taught marketing for about 12 years, and he taught until he was just not able to do it anymore, which is early 80s, believe it or not.
Wow.
And he had a great experience. The students really enjoyed it. They stayed in touch with him. He had a really interesting career. He'd been at CBS as a president of the division, and he'd run Olympus Camera here in the U.S. And he had a lot of really neat, first Manhattan Cable TV, which was the first cable TV operation he did here in the city with Chuck Dolan. And so there were a lot of great experiences, and he brought that to the classroom. So that helped inspire me because I could see how much he enjoyed that and how much the students got out of it. And actually, my favorite professor in college was a gentleman who had retired, and he was just great. He taught finance, and he also gave some great examples out of his history. So as time went on, I realized that there wasn't at Wake Forest a private equity course. And initially, I thought maybe I'd guest lecture or something like that, but there was no one to teach it, and they really didn't have any plans. So a few years ago, one thing led to another, and we said, well, we could develop a course. There's a great textbook out of Harvard Business School by Josh Lerner that we could use. And what we do is we both do chapters out of the textbook, and we do the typical lectures and those sorts of things. But we also have a number of industry executives from private equity come in.
Oh, good.
So we've got investors, we've got CEOs, we've got people who are lenders. We actually have private equity firms that come in and do their pitch to the students, that the students are basically the investors. And so put yourself in the place of, would you invest in this fund or not, and why? Ask the questions you'd want to know if you were going to invest in this fund. And the private equity executives are great to go along with that. So we'll have venture funds that do that. We'll have
great.
private equity funds of all certain size. So it's been great. The students have been have been wonderful with their feedback, and it's really a neat ability to provide that value. And then also, it's kind of interesting is try to stay on top of the latest trends, because one of the things we teach them and we hopefully follow is private equity is continually evolving, right? It changes day by day, month by month. And so we try to stay on top of all those trends. So it's actually, I can actually even do that more than if you're doing day-to-day in private equity, because here you're kind of surveying the whole landscape from soup to nuts, whereas typically if you're running a private equity firm, you're in your own segment. But it's been great. I have a professor who's taught at Wake Forest for 20 years who worked with me, Bill Markham, and it's been a great partnership.
That's great. That's great. So what are some of the quotes or, Brockway isms that we can at least get on audio here?
I get a kick out of it because I do hear some of them coming from you, even
I
in
still
print.
quote you. Yeah, I still tagline you on those.
You do all the time, and I appreciate that. And some of them I actually had borrowed from some other people. So
they got lost. Revisionist quotations, I guess, right?
Exactly. But I think you talked about the one that's kind of, the experience is what you get when you don't get what you want, and to create something of value and people will pay for it. It's absolutely true. Another one which we kind of mentioned is investing in what you know.
Yeah.
You've got to know. If you don't understand the industry, you're in trouble. So those are all ones. And then sometimes it's just classic stuff like pigs get slaughtered, and that's true. If you're always hanging on for that last buck, you got to leave something in the tank for the next people. When you sell a company, you've got to have a good growth strategy, and you want your companies to do well after you sell them. No one wants the reputation you sell it basically when the transmission's about to fall out.
Yeah,
right?
one guy said to me one time, so if it's a good time for you to be selling, why is it a good time for me to be buying?
Yeah.
Well,
and the truth is, and it's a great thing about buying from a private equity firm, is we've got to turn a company in 4, 5, 6, 7 years. And when you've got a big gain, you should take it. So there are lots of companies that we've sold, almost all of them, that we would love to be on the buy side because it's still got a lot of legs to it. But we just have to sell. It's one of the things actually the private equity industry is working now to address with these long-dated funds. So there are a number of funds that will hold for 15 to 20 years. Even the biggest private equity firms are getting these long-dated funds because they were frustrated that you would have a family office come in, and family office says, hey, look, we're not going to sell you. We're going to keep you for the long term. You don't have to go through this every 5 years. All these great reasons. And now the private equity folks have come up with a model that basically can keep it for 15, 20 years. And
so they call it like an evergreen fund is what I've heard. I don't know if it's
evergreen, long dated. There are different terms for it, but the same thing, a long time hold.
But it is harder to grow company. Once a company gets to a certain size, it's much harder to double, as the law of large numbers, things are, it seems like the middle markets, you've got 5 to 10 of EBITDA to get to 20 to 25. And if you're really good at that.
I always think the lower middle market and up to the middle market's more like sports cars, right? So you can turn on a dime quicker, you can make more progress as a percentage just because it's smaller. And the bigger the company is, obviously it takes longer. It's like the tanker, they always think turning around takes forever. The flip side is for the bigger funds, obviously it's harder to invest big pieces of capital. If you got to invest in bulk and you've got a lot of capital, then that's a place, and you still can earn a great return, obviously, on the bigger deals. But the smaller deals, you can get kind of crazy returns where you make 10 times your money or 15 times your money. Where on a bigger deal, if you get 2 times your money or 3, you're very happy with that.
Right. So let's go back to August of 1999. I lived 3 blocks away from the office, and I sat around a table.
We like that because you could be there basically all the time.
Yeah, I remember that. That's back when the cell phones were working, so I was able to get there within like 7 minutes in my
That's good.
My green Camry with a fin on the back. So we were at a conference room table, probably this size, I would say.
Right. And you explained the internet to me.
I did explain the internet.
I didn't ever understand it quite as well as after I saw your chart.
So I bought a big piece of white oak tag from Kinko's at the time. Yep. And I laid out for Peter all the different players in the internet space and how the internet was going to evolve.
Unbelievable.
It was good,
right? You were right on target.
Spot on. I was just a couple years too early, I think, but it was a good experience. But we had the Gold's Gym deal under LOI,
which was a fun deal. I mean, Gold's Gym was fun from the start to the end, and the fact you were in the middle of it obviously has led to lots of great things.
Yeah, well, the reason why I'm doing this, I guess, is all because of that deal.
It was one of the more interesting deals to actually negotiate because it's a real brand, right? So of the 3 owners that were there, 2 of the 3 of them were bodybuilders, right? I think we had Mr. Empire State and Mr. World. And so these are back in the days when you actually were in a closing room to do a deal. And so we're in Chicago for a week closing this deal, a week in person in what was then.
It doesn't happen anymore.
It doesn't happen. Now it's all conference calls and all electronic. But so we're there trying to get this deal closed. And the very passionate people on the other side, but they they're people in the bodybuilding business. So we had something in the language of the deal that said all of the assets of Gold's Gym we would own.
Right.
And so it became apparent that there was a bit of a holdup with the primary seller, that he had the Mr. World title. He thought the Mr. World title was one of the assets of Gold's Gym, and that I would become Mr. World.
No.
Which I know it's easy, for those of us here, it's easy to believe that I would be Mr. World.
Yeah, well, you used to bulk, you were bulked up before.
I was really bulked up. So literally an hour conversation, basically, to convince that, no, that was a personal asset. It wasn't an asset of Gold's Gym. and that no, I was
If you
not
were
going to become
Mr. World, though, I mean, I don't know if you would have stayed in private equity.
I probably would have just made that my gig. You know why?
Yeah.
If you're Mr. World, why fool around with private
just
equity?
be like the Arnold tour. It'd
Exactly.
be the Brockway tour, and it'd be Mr. World.
But you talked about we were talking about passion beforehand, and there was so much passion on that brand. We used to go to the convention with 1,000 people who were Gold's Gym franchisees, and the passion was absolutely incredible. There was, the marketing side of it. Derek Barden, who ran the marketing side, was just super passionate about the brand, and the marketing was great. And it was just one of those brands that kind of, captured your imagination. And it was a lot of fun from start to finish. It turned out to be a good investment for us as well. But the fact that it led to us being
led
together.
to the Halo talks and everything else.
Well, you did a great
done.
job because you really understood it, and you, with your internet, obviously, you put us into thinking about the internet a lot quicker than we would otherwise have thought.
Yeah, I think I was helped architect the original BrockwayMoran.com site as well.
I bet you did.
I was way ahead of my time.
The only thing
there.
is, I remember the conversation back and forth is I did say, Pete, I think we're not venture capital investors. I think we're private equity investors, and that we can't do a venture capital deal in the middle of this fund.
You were 100% right. Look, I came out of business school kind of, they kind of brainwashed you at business school.
And actually, I don't know if I ever told you, but that staying away from the internet helped us because our first fund's a 1998 fund. So they look at funds by vintages. And that 1998 fund was in the top 10% of all private equity funds raised in basically in performance. And one of the reasons is we stayed away from things we didn't understand.
Yep.
And we were in venture capital, so we stayed away from the internet.
Yeah.
We stayed
so
away from
tempting,
telecom.
though, right?
It was because everybody was saying this was the place to go. And telecom, we stayed away from telecom. And those two areas just obviously crashed. And we avoid that carnage, luckily. And but still, the deal turned out to be great. And the fact that we got to know you from it is a
thanks
joy.
again for letting me go on to that foray into the desert.
Oh, it was great. I think
Phoenix.
It was good all around, and it brought out your entrepreneurial spirits.
Yeah, I don't think I could have done anything else. I mean, I was trying to be a good soldier for you.
You were. You absolutely were.
I always tell people that I was that Fitness Insight was an affiliate of Gold's Gym, even though just to make it feel like it was like
and you were
under your consent,
and it was, and it was
with and under your consent. But with the Gold's deal, obviously there's, a lot of passion. There was a lot of different ways you could take it. You could take it to the internet. You could have said, okay, let's do franchising, licensing. Let's build corporate. Maybe if you can think back to, what was in your wheelhouse to say, okay, this makes the most sense. And it kind of led back towards acquisitions and greenfields, which was definitely
right. And we were, and one of the biggest frustrations in this business is you can't hold it forever. So we had 5 years with Gold's Gym. What we were trying to do over those 5 years, and now this is pretty dated, right? Because we sold about 15 years ago. But what we were trying to do is to broaden up the brand a little bit, to make it a little more welcoming to people without you losing that heritage. So keep the bodybuilder heritage, but make it more welcoming to people so that they don't feel intimidated. When you walk into cardio, and the strength is in the back.
Right.
You don't.
And what'd you do with the logo?
The logo, we basically kept it the same, and we just
shaved the guy down a little. Though,
yeah, we just kind of softened some of the edges.
Yeah.
And so that was our goal, and then the franchisees were the backbone because there's only one gym that historically Gold's Gym owned. We also merged with someone in Washington, the Galliani brothers, who were great partners, and they actually had made the deal to buy Gold's Gym, but we wanted to keep the franchisees close to us, and so we didn't change things a lot with the franchisees because we said these people have brought us here, they've been our partners, and we want to build on it. So those were all the things we were trying to do with it, and it worked well, but unfortunately after 5 years we had to sell.
Got it. Well, it was a successful deal, and I only want nothing the best for Gold's Gym. They deserve it.
Us as well, for sure.
To get back into the spotlight.
Yep.
So as you look forward here over the next several years, what are you looking to do personally, besides the Wake Forest and you've got some side investments and obviously you help the Blue Sea guys. So what's the life plan?
It's a great part of life. So obviously the Wake Forest is taking some time and effort. I'm a number of charitable boards I'm on as well. Boca Helping Hands and the Boca Regional Hospital, and then also investments. So it's been really great to make investments with people I know that I've known for a lot of years. private equity, both in funds and also direct investments as well. So all those things are kind of fun, to keep my hand in those things, but without having the day-to-day responsibility. So it's an interesting part of life, and it's funny. My mother had these things that she would say to my father that have kept in my mind. One of these, when she was a counselor in the 70s, and she just says you have to retire to something, not from something. So I've got a lot of twos as far as Wake Forest and some of the board work and some of the investments I'm making. And the other thing which she said, which is a great line, is she said to my father, I married you for better or worse, but not for lunch. So you got to make sure you got the middle of the day well occupied of stuff for you're doing.
Gotcha.
So I got a number of things that basically are very enjoyable.
And how do you feel about your daughters both being into the technology and probably throwing venture ideas out at you, and you have to kind of calibrate those?
And they're two
as a father and an investor.
Yeah, they're two totally different. So our younger daughter has actually got a venture capital backed firm that matter of fact, she's in 6 pitches today.
Oh, wow.
So it's kind of interesting to just be speaking to her. She's going to 6 different appointments today with various venture capital firms. So she's living that life of a venture capital-backed firm. Our older daughter works for a company that goes back to 2012, so it's definitely more mature, and she's running one of their business units. So she's seen it where it's gotten a little bit more, a little bit more mature, and now it's got a number of people. But they both have gravitated to young companies that are fast-growing, that are exciting. They both worked in San Francisco. Our younger daughter is now here in New York. But New York has a great venture capital-backed ecosystem as well.
Yes.
But it's kind of interesting to see it through their eyes and kind of root them on.
Yeah. Those are companies that you don't put much debt on. Those are all equity plays.
Yeah, I think to get debt, you do need earnings. Although actually,
Still?
my older daughter's company, I'm sure, has earnings, but I'm talking more about our younger daughter, which is just a startup.
Yeah. Well, thanks for being on the show. It's been a good education for everyone. Great to see you as always.
Great to see you.
And hopefully people got some good nuggets of wisdom out of this, and to some of the quotes that I'll continue to live by, and you as well.
Go ahead and use them, and no royalties required.
No royalties required. Peter Brockway, Halo Talks NYC. Thanks, Peter.